Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 96 called Hello, Goodbye. We heard in the last episode how Justinian had left the Roman Empire overextended. Put simply, his western conquest meant the army was incapable of defending all of its long frontiers. Confronting this crisis after his death were two emperors, Justin II, as we heard about in the last episode, and in this episode we'll cover the reign of Tiberius II. Both ruled for a relatively short time, Justin for only 9 years and Tiberius for 8. They were the hello goodbye emperors. So let's pick up where we left off in the last episode. In a rare moment of lucidity, Justin agreed with his domineering wife Sophia and no doubt a host of senators that Tiberius, the empire's leading general and Justin's right-hand man, should be made Caesar during his mental breakdown. But there was a problem. Sophia really wanted to rule the show. Remember, she was the niece of Justinian's wife Theodora and had inherited her toughness. Right from the beginning, she'd been instrumental in securing her husband's elevation to emperor. And now that he'd become deranged, she stepped into his shoes to manage the government. She voted for Tiberius, presumably because she thought she could control him. For example, she wouldn't let him bring his wife and children into the great palace in case his wife Ino thought she was the real empress. Accordingly, during the remaining 4 years of Justin's life, Ino and her 2 daughters lived in a house near the palace. But the problems really began when Justin died in 578 and Tiberius was inaugurated as emperor. He put his foot down and his family were admitted to the palace, much to Sophia's distaste, and Ino assumed the name Anastasia, which was deemed a more fitting Christian name for an empress. But the story of Sophia's fight for supremacy wasn't over, as we'll soon find out. Let me just say a few words on the sources for this period. We are, of course, dependent on good sources to form any sort of understanding of any time in history. And one of the problems with Justin II and Tiberius is that the sources are very poor. Their reigns lie in a gap between the excellent record of Justinian's reign, left to us by Procopius, and the record of Tiberius's successor, the Emperor Maurice, whose extraordinary and much longer reign is well recorded by the chronicler Theophylact of Simocatta, whom many historians regard as the last classical writer. I must add that I'm pronouncing the Emperor Maurice using the British pronunciation rather than Maurice, which may be more popular in the US. His Latin name was Mauricius, and in Greek, Maurikios, which was actually his native language since he was the first Greek-speaking Roman emperor since Anastasius. So feel free to pick whichever version of his name you prefer. Back to our narrative and the question of what really went on in Tiberius's reign. 2 things stand out. First, there was a military revival, with the first victories scored over Persia since Justinian's generals Bessas and Martinus had reasserted Roman control of Lazica in the 550s. Second, he overspent and left Maurice an empty treasury and a bankrupt state. So let's look at the financial position first. In the last episode, we heard how Justin II was short of cash and struggled to find the money to fight both Persia and the Lombards. Therefore, it's very surprising when we learn that Tiberius didn't seem to be short of money at all. For example, when he became Caesar, he reduced taxes by a quarter for the next 4 years, and in 575 he forgave tax arrears going back to 571. The army received generous donatives from him, and he made gifts to his supporters. In 578, to celebrate his becoming sole emperor when Justin died, these gifts spiralled to £7,200 of gold, or just over 500,000 gold coins. This generosity certainly made him popular, as we'll hear more about shortly. He also expanded the army, recruiting 15,000 new soldiers, which was effectively an entire new field army, something not even Justinian had done. So, where was the money coming from? On the one hand, we hear from contemporaries that he was overspending. For example, to curb his generosity, Sophia reputedly refused to give him full control over the treasury until she was ejected from power by Justin's death in 578. The chronicler John of Ephesus says he was profligate and used up a special financial reserve set up by the Emperor Anastasius that had been set aside for national emergencies only. But that sounds strange, since Procopius was adamant Justinian more than used up Anastasius's reserves long before Tiberius came to the throne. And apparently a rumour circulated in Constantinople that he'd found a secret treasure. Historians are still puzzled by Tiberius's largesse. Although I have no evidence on which to base this, I wonder whether there was an economic resurgence in Tiberius's reign as a result of the end of a recent outbreak of plague. You recall that the first outbreak of the Justinianic plague, which swept the empire and the whole of Europe from its initial outbreak in Pelusium in 541, had died down, at least within most of the territories of the Roman Empire, by 549. However, there were several recurrences, one of which was in 573 in Constantinople, and it may well have been active in the years before this date. So after 574, as the damage done by the plague reduced, there might have been an economic resurgence in Tiberius's reign as people made up for the lost years of commercial disruption. And wealthier people meant higher tax revenues. And that would make sense in the context of explaining why Tiberius chose to forgive tax arrears back to 571, since it would have been in precisely those years, from 571 to 573, that the plague was probably at its most virulent, thereby making it difficult for people to pay tax. In addition, the reason for Tiberius's apparent profligacy might have been part of a general increase in spending and a more overtly wealthy lifestyle after the plague. As with so many aspects of the reigns of the Hello Goodbye emperors, we can only speculate on what was really happening, and Tiberius's tax policies continue to baffle historians. But we are much clearer about the course of events with respect to the other major issue in his reign, the war with Persia. In the last episode, we heard how Justin II broke the 10-year truce with Persia in 572 and then failed to take Nisibis, followed in 574 by Khosroes' highly successful counteroffensive when the aged Shah captured Dara, the jewel in the Roman crown, in its eastern defences, allegedly causing Justin's madness. As mentioned earlier, Sophia sprang into action and bought peace with Khosroes for 1 year at a cost of 45,000 solidi. This was extended for 3 years at a cost of 30,000 solidi per annum. However, most of Rome's treaties with Persia only extended to Mesopotamia and excluded Armenia, which contained a rebellious Christian population under Persian control in Pers Armenia, and this treaty was no exception. Therefore, in the years from 575 to 577, fighting continued in Armenia. We have limited and sometimes conflicting information about this war, but we know Khosroes invaded Armenia in 575 or 576. He headed for Theodosiopolis, but its strong walls defeated him. Meanwhile, Tiberius appointed Justinian, who was Germanus's son, Germanus being a cousin of Justinian the Great, so very well connected, to command the Roman army in Armenia. Justinian stopped Khosroes from advancing into Cappadocia, but Khosroes sidestepped his army by moving north to sack Sebastia, although he was worried he might advance too far into Roman territory and be surrounded. So he retreated, with Justinian pursuing him. At this point, our sources diverge. Theophylact of Samosata says Justinian won a great victory over Khosroes, with the Persians broken by a Roman cavalry charge. The Persian baggage train was then captured with a good deal of plunder, including the gold, silver and pearls which Khosroes normally wore, and all the furniture in his tent. However, another source, John of Ephesus, claims Justinian didn't win a battle against Khosroes and merely happened to capture his tent and personal belongings in an ambush in the Armenian mountains. He also says the Persians suffered heavy casualties not fighting the Romans, but as they made a very difficult crossing across the Euphrates on their way home. Whatever the truth, Khosroes was firmly on the back foot and opened peace negotiations, helped a little bit by the Persian general Takhuzro scoring a minor victory over Justinian in Armenia. It was at this point in 578 that Justin II died, and Tiberius was crowned Augustus, formally taking over as sole emperor and pushing Sophia firmly out of her position in government. His first action was to appoint a new commander of the Eastern Army. Exit Justinian, who returned to Constantinople, where he plotted with Sophia against Tiberius, and enter a new and vitally important character in our story, Maurice, the future emperor, who would very nearly save the Roman Empire in its hour of need. Let's begin with a description of this man left to us by the chronicler Leo Grammaticus, writing some 200 years later, admittedly, who said, quote, Maurice originated from the territory of the Cappadocians. He was of medium build, strong, pale-skinned, round-faced, red-haired and balding at the front, shapely-nosed and beardless, since he shaved his chin, in accordance with Roman fashion. End quote. Like Tiberius and before him Justin I and Justinian, Maurice secured his first foot on the ladder to power by becoming a humble member of the imperial guard. He was described as Tiberius's notary when Tiberius was count of the excubitors, effectively the head of the imperial guard. Notary is translated literally as secretary, which has caused some historians to think Maurice didn't have military training. I think this is almost certainly wrong, and notary really meant head of the military staff, and as such Maurice was a professional soldier, just as Tiberius had been. When Tiberius became Caesar back in 574, Maurice replaced him as Count of the Excubitors. His relationship with Tiberius was obviously very strong. Indeed, he was effectively his right-hand man, and this was reflected in his next appointment as head of the Eastern Army, or Magister Militum per Orientum, in 578. In addition, he was made Count of the Federates, a force of 15,000 soldiers, as I mentioned earlier, and referred to by our sources as mainly Germans recruited from outside the empire in around 574 to 5. This regiment is shrouded in mystery. Most historians think it was a unit of mercenaries, but I suspect these were Germanic recruits into a Roman-trained and equipped force, such as those Procopius described Belisarius had in his armies. The fact this force was also sometimes referred to as Tiberianoi, or Tiberius's soldiers, suggests they were regular soldiers rather than a collection of mercenaries. The 4-year peace treaty with Persia, purchased by Sophia in 574, was due to run out in 578, and Tiberius wanted Maurice to launch a major offensive against the Persians, spearheaded by the Tiberianoi. As usual with this period, our sources provide little insight into why Tiberius thought this would meet with success, but the answer probably lies with an obscure comment made by a minor chronicler, Menander, who tells us the Persians were distracted by Turkish attacks on their eastern frontier. When peace negotiations broke down, the Persians attacked first, hoping to disrupt the expected Roman invasion by capturing the Roman strongholds at Amida and Constantina. But their attempts came to nothing, and Maurice's troops surged forward, capturing several forts, including Aphum, and taking 10,000 prisoners, before capturing the important fortress of Singara, although other Persian strongholds like that of Nisibis were far too well defended to be taken. Nevertheless, the Roman army had clearly regained the initiative. Maurice's troops spread out far and wide into Persian Mesopotamia, plundering and ravaging. It was at this point in February or March 579 that Khosroes died, allegedly in despair, as he watched Roman forces advancing into Persian territory from his fortress mountaintop in Carduccia. The great Khosroes, who had reigned for a staggering 48 years and humiliated Justinian time and again, was succeeded by his son, Hormizd IV. Peace negotiations ensued, which Hormizd extended for as long as possible in order to move troops west from the Eastern Front, where the Turkish war seems to have been easing. Consequently, there was no fighting in 580, but, emboldened by Maurice's successes in 578, Tiberius commanded him to launch the most ambitious Roman invasion of Persia, probably since the Emperor Julian's disastrous Great Expedition of 363. The target this time was not Nisibis, but the Persian capital itself, Ctesiphon. Similar to the Emperor Julian's Great Offensive, but on a much smaller scale, Maurice marched down the Euphrates, heading for Ctesiphon, accompanied by a fleet of ships, and his Arab allies, led by the unreliable Al-Mundir, who this time at least was happy to be on the Roman side. Our sources are woefully thin about what happened, but it seems he succeeded in reaching the vicinity of Ctesiphon, where he discovered the Persian bridge across the Tigris had, not surprisingly, been cut. Similar to the Emperor Julian, he decided it was too risky to launch an assault on the strongly defended Persian capital. Messengers also arrived telling him the Persians were desperately launching diversionary attacks along the whole of the Eastern Front, including at Edessa, where they threatened to cut off Maurice's line of retreat. Like Julian, Maurice called a halt to the offensive. The Roman army retreated, abandoning equipment including 800 fine white horses, which the Persians took in triumph. According to Theophylact, but not mentioned by John of Ephesus, Maurice fought a successful rearguard action against the pursuing Persians. And unlike the Emperor Julian, at least Maurice made it back home with most of his army. As usual, the Arabs were accused of treachery, and Al-Mundir, as had happened before, was arrested. Meanwhile, with most of the army fighting in Persia, the Danube and Italian fronts caved in. Tiberius resorted to Justinian's policy of paying tribute to the Avars, who he referred to as that ugly nation of hairy barbarians, reputedly paying 80,000 solidi in 574 or 575, both for them to respect Roman territory and also for them to keep the Slavs under control who were crossing the Danube in increasingly large numbers. But in 578, the Avars decided they wanted a piece of the action themselves and laid siege to Sirmium. Remarkably, the city held out for over 2 years, but in 582 it surrendered on condition that most of its inhabitants could leave unharmed. The Avars, impressed with their valiant defence, kept their word. In Italy, the Lombards were still lording it over the Romans, although Rome and Ravenna held out against them. In 576, the Lombards won a victory over the small Roman army of occupation, and the Romans retreated back to the safety of their walls and spent their money bribing the Lombard warlords to fight each other, as well as tempting the Franks to invade northern Italy. Back on the eastern front, our sources are limited, but it seems a major Persian counterattack in 581 was defeated at Constantina, although Maurice may not have been commanding the army at that particular point, for his eyes were firmly set elsewhere, this time on the political situation in Constantinople. Tiberius had fallen desperately ill. No satisfactory medical explanation is provided by our sources, although a minor one, Theodosius of Miletini, says he died from eating poisoned mulberries. A possible explanation, I wonder, is whether this was a murder attempt by the resentful and relegated Empress Sophia, who we know continued to plot against him after he ejected her from the palace. But there is no actual evidence for this. Knowing that death was imminent, Tiberius did at least plan his succession. Initially, he thought about dividing the empire, marrying his two daughters, one to Maurice in the east and the other to Germanus in the west. But he changed his mind and bequeathed the entire empire to Maurice, betrothing him to his daughter Constantina. According to the chronicler Paul the Deacon, his dying words to Maurice on the 14th of August 582 were, quote, "I pass my crown to you with this girl. Always respect, equity, and justice," end quote. Tiberius's reign remains shrouded in mystery. All our sources say he was the most popular emperor since Anastasius. Not only did he reduce the burden of taxation, but he was tall, handsome, of regal bearing, yet also gentle and humane. For example, he was conspicuously enlightened about religious matters and tolerated the Monophysites, apparently declaring to the Chalcedonian Patriarch of Constantinople, "Are they not Christians? What then is your problem?" The great historian Edward Gibbon liked him, quote, "After recording the vice or folly of so many Roman princes, it's pleasing to repose for a moment on a character conspicuous by the qualities of humanity, justice, temperance, and fortitude," end quote. But the distinguished Irish historian J.B. Berry didn't share this view, saying he was irresponsible with his financial management and set the empire on course for bankruptcy, which poisoned the inheritance he passed to Maurice. I agree with that, and I think Tiberius was also lucky with two things which made him seem more successful than he really was. One was the end of a bout of plague when he became Caesar in 574, as I mentioned earlier, which probably meant there was an economic recovery and therefore more tax revenue to play with. Second, the Turks attacked the Persians in the east, allowing Maurice to score victories against a reduced Persian army, which was, of course, the problem in Justin's reign when the Turks failed to materialize on the Persians' eastern front. But whatever we think of Tiberius, one thing is for sure. With Maurice's accession, we are now entering the final stage of Roman history. If you thought the story so far was tumultuous, prepare yourself for the ride ahead, for Rome's last century will stretch credulity far more than anything you have yet heard. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in 2 weeks' time, on the 19th of October. And if you like the podcast, please do leave a review and recommend it to a friend. That would be great. The podcast is entirely free, requires no subscription, and doesn't even have adverts. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes to find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.